everyone, welcome to the July 11th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona here with my usual co-host Craig Mulkowski, and we are looking back at the last week in racing on the precipice of one of the most exciting weeks in racing as we're about to kick off the Saratoga meet later this week. Del Mar will follow the week after that. Summer season is always a really fun time for racing fans and horse players, so Craig and I will put out as much content as we can through the summer covering both Saratoga and Del Mar, and I'm sure we'll be doing some Saratoga handicapping on our podcast just later this week. But before we get to that, we're going to take a look back at some racing that happened really around the country this past weekend, as there's just not one venue that we could spend too much time at. There were some major 3-year-old races happening on various surfaces, both on the East Coast, the West Coast, the Midwest. We're going to visit quite a few venues on this Pacecast, Craig.
Yeah, we are. There were quite a few Derbies and Oaks this week and even a few last week, but some pretty good performances, a lot of figures to talk about, so looking forward to getting into it.
Yeah, the only Grade 1 races occurred in New York. That was the stacked Saturday card where they ran the Belmont Derby, Belmont Oaks, the Suburban, the Victory Ride at Belmont Park. We'll recap that, as well as another stakes at Belmont from Friday. Then we'll move on to Horseshoe Indianapolis, where they ran the Indiana Derby, and some other stakes from that Saturday card. Prairie Meadows, they ran the Iowa Derby. Los Alamitos, they ran the Los Alamitos Derby. We'll go through all of those races for the 3-year-olds, and then we'll finish things up on the podcast with the Delaware Handicap at Delaware, and then a couple of non-stakes races from Ellis Park and Laurel. But Craig, we'll start at Belmont Park, where they did run the highest quality racing of this past weekend, and we'll begin with those 2 Grade 1 races for the 3-year-olds on the turf from Saturday. And something that we've been talking about really from the start of the year is how this crop of 3-year-old turf horses has been running some nice speed figures going all the way back to the winter time in both maiden and allowance races. We saw that follow through to some stakes events earlier this year in Kentucky and New York. And boy, this Belmont Derby did not disappoint from a quality standpoint.
It did not at all, and boy did the winner Farbridge really put it all together finally. I mean, not that he's been running bad, he hasn't. He's been running all good races, but he's had some issues, some maybe caused by himself. He changed riders for this one, went to Jose Ortiz and got the job done in convincing fashion. And not only that, he ran a huge speed figure. He wound up with a 124 on the TimeformUS scale. Luckily for me, we also had the Belmont Oaks run at the exact same distance, and it was one that the time disparity was so big that I actually went back and timed the races just to be sure, and both of them were spot on. We'll talk about the Oaks a little bit after this one, but I thought it was a really impressive performance by Farbridge, and that 124 speed figure I think seems pretty legit to me, and it's one I don't remember ever giving to a 3-year-old this early in the year.
Yeah, that's the kind of numbers that we typically see for the best 3-year-old dirt horses, and generally the 3-year-olds on the turf lag behind their dirt counterparts a little bit, but not the case this year. And I've got to say, Craig, I can't quibble with this number. I'm not too surprised to see this race come up really fast because it looked like a really strong race on the way in. You weren't sure which of the horses that had already run those fast speed figures was going to step up against this pretty competitive field, but as you said, Farbridge, I mean, he's just never run a bad race in his career, and while he was maybe a little bit unlucky to lose the prior race, the Pennine Ridge, and then couldn't quite get the job done in a photo in the American Turf, he just keeps showing up from race to race and feels like the rider switch back to Jose Ortiz really allowed him to show his true talent here. Jose Ortiz just gave this horse a fantastic ride, just made every right move, saving ground the entire way, tipping out at the top of the stretch when he needed to, and was able to mow down the leader. Some people thought the Foxes may have run the best race overall because he did have to wait longer in traffic and was really finishing at the end, but you kind of had to know it was a possibility that the Foxes might not get an ideal trip given the fact that he drew the outside post in this 11-horse field. These European runners just generally aren't that quick out of the gate, and we saw that here with the Foxes. He broke about a length behind the field, which put him so far back in the early stages. He was really finishing though, Craig, and I think it just bolsters the fact that this appeared to be a really strong race because, as we talked about last week, the Foxes was coming in with some very legitimate European form.
Yes, he wasn't a horse who was running in Europe and just not getting the job done, so they kind of sent him here to find easier competition. He was a horse who went off only 7-1 in the English Derby, so obviously had some very nice credentials coming in and ran to him. He just ran into a horse that maybe got a little bit better trip, but I also think he's a horse who earned that trip with his good tactical speed. As you say, he just was a little quicker out of the gate, able to get better position, and in the end, that does count to the overall race.
And speaking of trips, I don't want to overlook the journeys of Mondego and Webslinger, who I thought also ran huge races here. I mean, the top four finished 4 lengths clear of the other 7 rivals in this race, so I think everybody in the Superfecta really put in a terrific effort. And, Mondego was competing in a race where the closers generally did pretty well aside from him. He was sort of a surprising leader in this race. I don't think most people expected him to get hustled to the front, but got to give him credit for putting away those other speeds that would have, on paper, looked to have more quality than he did, and kicking on at the end obviously got swallowed up by some of those late runners towards the last furlong. And also Webslinger, Craig, watching the race back, both Farbridge and the Foxes saved all the ground, and while the Foxes did have to wait in traffic for a while, he didn't cover nearly as much ground as a lot of others in this race, getting over to the inside from the outside post position. Webslinger, and maybe this is just the horse because it seems to happen to him every single time, but he got angled about 5 wide on the far turn and covered so much more ground than everybody else. So I don't think it's necessarily so clear that maybe Webslinger didn't run the best race of all, but I think it sets up a pretty intriguing matchup if all of these horses, or at least the 3 Americans, proceed on to the next leg of this series at Saratoga.
I wonder if Javier Castellano was just thinking that's how he's run all his races, and let's just keep doing the same thing, and you can't really argue with it. But I was wondering when I watched the race, I wasn't too happy. I actually had bet him a little bit at those 9-1 odds that he seemed not to care about ground loss in there. Maybe it was just when he had to move, but I do think there's an argument to be made that he maybe ran the best race as well. What I want to say most about this race, what I find the most impressive is it was done at a mile and a quarter, something that a lot of times horses don't handle it, but it seems like these early season 3-year-olds, I should say. I mean, we're still just in July, just starting the second half of the year, and if these horses want to compete in the biggest races as you move on, you have to go longer, and it sure looked like several of them could to me because they handled this mile and a quarter pretty easily.
Yeah, I'm going back a number of years with this comparison, but this year with the 3-year-old turf horses, it reminds me a little bit of that year. Oh, I can't even say how many years ago it was when we had Kitten's Joy and Artie Schiller competing in some of these 3-year-old races, different races. I think they had the Virginia Derby back then, and the Belmont Derby has sort of filled that spot on the calendar in recent times, but those horses were running the kinds of speed figures that said they could compete against olders later in the year, and that proved to be the case. So I'll be really intrigued to see where they go after this series of races in New York with some of these runners, because races like the Breeders' Cup typically aren't targeted by the 3-year-olds in this division later on. The olders are just assumed to be better, but this feels like a year of unusual quality in this 3-year-old crop.
Yeah, and to show how unusual it is, I looked it up while you were talking. It was 2004. It's back when Kitten's Joy and Artie Schiller were 3-year-olds. So it's been quite a while.
Let's move on to the other race, grade 1 event, going a mile and a quarter for the 3-year-olds, the fillies. That was the Belmont Oaks run as race 8 at Belmont on Saturday. And like you were saying, Craig, just similar pace situation, but just a much slower final time for these 3-year-old fillies. And that's not a big surprise. I mean, maybe the disparity in how great it was a little bit bigger than some might have expected, but just on paper, this handicapped as a weaker race overall than the Belmont Derby, and I think we kind of saw that in who won the race. I mean, Aspen Grove was coming over with some mediocre European form. I mean, she had competed against the best over there, but hadn't really been competitive with them the way that the Foxes had in the Derby. But she was still able to beat all of the Americans in here. Did get a fantastic ride from Asian Murphy to get the job done.
She did. I don't have a whole lot to say about this race. It was pretty puzzling from a speed figure perspective, but I just couldn't come up with any reason to split those two races apart. And trust me, I tried because I didn't want to give this race just a 105, which is really low, even for this time of year for 3-year-old fillies. Several horses in here regress, but there's just not a whole lot to say. I guess the only thing I can figure is that maybe a lot of these American horses just didn't handle the 1.25 miles.
I think you see where this race differed from the Derby in that fourth quarter mile, the penultimate quarter mile, where Prerequisite, who was leading the way, just really kept slowing down the pace. And it was a race that just didn't feature much speed on paper. And Irad Ortiz just had the latitude to keep slowing down the entire race as much as he wanted to around that far turn. And, you see that blue color coded pace figure for the 1 mile fraction. And they did come home in sub 23. So it's not like they were walking at the end of this race. But you really see the difference there, whereas in the Belmont Derby, they were starting to speed up the race and create some separation at that point. So I think that accounts for some of the difference in the times. But also, Craig, the horses that were coming into this race with the best speed figures, Mission of Joy and Papilio, you could make some excuses for them in this race. I mean, Mission of Joy, it seemed like the 1.25 mile distance just didn't work for her. She was a little too keen every step of the way. You saw her not settling in the first half of the race. And when you're not settling going 1.25 miles as a 3-year-old, you're probably not going to get the distance. And then Papilio, I mean, I kind of overlooked this when I first watched the race, but she just stumbled so badly at the start. I mean, she basically hit her nose on the turf course when they came out of the starting gate, and a little bit unlucky. And also, as you kind of talked about, and we both talked about on the forecast last week, she's a hard horse to ride, and you could see Javier Castellano came into the stretch looking like he still had something left, but you can't fully set her down with the whip because she will get to lugging in, and Javier knows her so well right now. He kind of tried to keep her to that light hand ride to keep her straight, and she just couldn't quite get there at the end. But take nothing away from Aspen Grove. She delivered coming in with that European form, and the class relief really proved the difference. And I think we can move on to the next race because I don't think Craig has a whole lot else to say about this one. Just generally some disappointments from the horses that were expected to do well. Again, Craig, another race that we probably don't have to spend too much time on was the Grade 2 Suburban run early in the day. This shaped up on paper as a confidence builder for Charge It. Just didn't seem like anybody else of that stature really had a desire to face him in this race. They ended up going to some different spots, and Charge It went off as the odds-on favorite and just never looked like a loser on the racetrack.
No, he didn't. He wasn't challenged early. The one horse on who maybe on paper looked like he might be able to give him a run was Tonal Impact, who wound up going off second choice in the race. That one just didn't show up at all, didn't do any running. So it was basically a paid workout. Wound up with a 126 TimeformUS speed figure, which when you look at the other horses in here, it makes perfect sense. Obviously, it was the only 1.25 mile race run on the card, and that's a little bit strange distance at Belmont, but they run it often enough that I have it narrowed down pretty good on how to make speed figures for it. So I'm fine with the speed figure. I would still tend to downgrade this race a little bit when Charge It shows up again because it's just going to look a lot better on paper than what I think it really was.
Yeah, it's very reminiscent of the Suburban that Tacitus won, I believe, 3 years ago, when so much was expected of him as a 4-year-old, and he kind of got his campaign off to a disappointing start. Got back on track with a smashing Suburban win, but then I believe that was the final win of Tacitus's career. We'll see if Charge It can fare better through the summer with his pedigree and his potential stud value. I think they've got to try Grade 1 races again to eventually get that victory. We'll see if they target the Whitney, which would be a quicker turnaround, or look at the Jockey Club Gold Cup going the same 1.25 mile distance later in the season at Saratoga. But you've got to imagine one of those races will be on his schedule, and we'll see if this confidence builder is able to get him to perform better against that top level competition. But I wouldn't want to take this short a price on him against some real foes because he's not been the most strong-willed horse when he gets into a fight in the past. Let's move on to the other graded stakes, I should say, that they ran on that Saturday card at Belmont. The final one of the day was the Grade 3 Victory Ride for the 3-year-old fillies going 6.5 furlongs on the dirt. This one, the New York prep for the Grade 1 Test Stakes that they'll run at Saratoga. And Greg, I think we saw the test favorite in Maple Leaf Mel, who takes her career record to 5 for 5. this race handicapped like one that would have a little more pace developing on the front end, but it just seemed like nobody really was interested in tangling with Maple Leaf Mel early, as she fairly easily got to the front and was able to just boss this field around, and she's really good. I mean, favorable pace scenario or not, this is a very talented 3-year-old filly.
That's the same point I was going to make. Yeah, she didn't really get challenged. Red Carpet Ready tried later in the race, faded out of it pretty quick. It never really looked like she was going to go by her. And just another really impressive effort by Maple Leaf Mel. She got a 118 final TimeformUS speed figure, 120 on final time, knocked down just a little bit because of the moderate pace. But yeah, she's going to be tough. It's especially if they let her go in the test. It's hard to see anybody running her down because it's not like they were making up ground on her in the stretch. She was gradually pulling away from the field, and one of the horses that we thought might challenge her, Dazzling Blue, actually got out of the gate pretty well in this time. It had been an issue for her, but Flavian Pratt didn't seem like he was interested in challenging, as you say, and you can't really blame him, I guess. I mean, she wound up running a good second in the race, so not a whole lot more to add. Just another good, strong effort by Maple Leaf Mel, and one that seems like the future is very, very promising.
Yeah, I was going to say the exact same thing about Dazzling Blue. She actually broke, and they just seemed to have a plan to rate her this time, not wanting to get into that early duel with Maple Leaf Mel, and kind of like they were only riding for second in this race, and it worked out. She got that graded stakes placing. I thought Vava, who I liked in this race, ran pretty well for third, but obviously just not in the same league as the winner of this race. And she's got to stretch out to 7 furlongs next time. Maple Leaf Mel does, but she certainly relaxes and finishes like a horse that's not going to have distance limitations. I mean, based on pedigree, I could even see her going a little bit longer than sprint races down the line, but obviously the test is the next goal, and she's going to be pretty tough in that spot if she continues to hold this form. And also, just want to mention, really great story with the connections and Melanie Giddings being given the chance to train this filly, obviously the former assistant to Jeremiah Englehart and others, and having been involved in this filly, overcoming some health scares to get to this point. Just a really nice story all around with this horse, and you love to see connections and smaller outfits getting chances with good horses, because we're going to need more of that for this sport to continue to thrive into the future. So it's great to see owners rewarding the smaller barns.
Yeah, I couldn't have said that better myself. We definitely are going to need more of that. Seeing smaller outfits get chances, and we've seen some success that year for lesser known trainers than the usual 5 or 6 guys that probably win the vast majority of the Grade 1 races. So good to see. We saw it in the Belmont Stakes. We see it again here. Foolish me, I'll probably try to beat her again in the test because I'll be hoping there's pace in. Grade 1s tend to play out a little bit differently, but anybody that does take her on is going to have to have their work cut out and better bring their running shoes, because she is quick. She gets out of the gate, and she also just kind of rates on that front end.
And we saw another relatively smaller barn, or at least smaller compared to some of the very large barns out there, and another woman trainer in Cherie DeVoe get a graded stakes victory on Friday at Belmont in the Manila Stakes. And this is one, Craig, where the 3 favorites really just took all of the money. Major Dude, Nagarok, and Talk of the Nation. I mean, they were coming in with the best speed figures, and they did look pretty formidable. But more than looks, he is a horse that has been improving with every single start, had shown a big late kick closing into some slow paces in his prior start, and in this race he definitely got some pace to run at.
He did. There's some of the fractions are coded in red in TimeformUS, but he still had to deliver, and his closing kick was impressive. The Cherie DeVoe barn, she really seems to be making a name for herself. I know she was the top assistant for Chad Brown for a long time, and it's taken a little while to get going. I mean, she was winning races right away, but it seems like she's getting better and better horses, and she's doing good things with them. So she's definitely one to watch going forward. And so is her 3-year-old Colt More Than Looks, because he showed he had that strong finishing kick for John Velasquez. Some might argue Talk of the Nation ran a better race. I wouldn't argue with them. He basically dueled with Nagarok pretty much all the way around the track, even fought back to get second over that one after he was passed in the lane. But both the 2-3 finishers ran very good races as well. But More Than Looks took advantage of what I thought was a pretty good setup, but still had to run a good race. It's not like he lucked into it.
And it sort of continues the conversation we were having about the quality of this crop of 3-year-old turf horses among the males. Another race that came up really fast. I mean, the top three finishers all getting TimeformUS speed figures of 117 plus. Obviously, due to the slight pace upgrade, Talk of the Nation and Nagarok got a 1 point higher speed figure, both 118 each for them, than the winner, More Than Looks. But still, this is a really fast race for 3-year-olds compared to prior years. And I agree, Craig. More Than Looks did get the right pace setup here, but just given his progressive pattern coming into this race and the way that he's able to close into races regardless of pace situation, it's a really likable attribute to have moving forward. So he's one that I would definitely want to keep my eye on in some bigger races later in the year. Let's move on to some 3-year-old action at different venues. At Horseshoe, Indianapolis, they ran the Grade 3 Indiana Derby on Saturday, and some familiar names in this one from the Kentucky Derby, as we saw Verifying and Raise Kane battling down to the wire here. Verifying probably got the better trip overall, stalking a pace that felt pretty moderate. Raise Kane took a shot at him late, but just couldn't quite get there, and Cagliostro also in there for third. Maybe a little race riding done by Verifying's rider to keep that one from getting a clear path in upper stretch, but Verifying did get his nose down on the wire first.
I did. The speed figure came back pretty light. I just got it from my assistant this morning. He's only getting a 111 TimeformUS speed figure. We'll talk about that. We're going to talk about the Oaks as well next, which also came back late. So it's one I want to give a look over, but 99% of the time I'm going to go with my assistant, and I'm sure he put plenty of thought into this, and I'm sure there's reasons these figures came back slow. There were tons of route races on the card. I'm sure it was a little tricky with an off track that was probably being worked on a lot during the day. So to me, it was a little bit of a disappointing effort for Verifying. I mean, he was 3-5 after all. He was expected to win this race, and it wound up being pretty tight at the wire, and some other horses who came in with much less credentials weren't very far behind either.
Yeah, Verifying is a horse that I think we've learned some things about him by this point, and he's very dangerous when he gets favorable pace setups and perfect trips, but when the trip doesn't work out perfectly, we tend to not see his best performance, and I think he's been pretty lucky in races like the Bluegrass, the Matt Winn, and the Indiana Derby. They just haven't gone that fast early, and it's allowed him to finish off those races. He's not a 3-year-old that I really view in the upper echelon of this division, so I would imagine Brad Cox kind of knows that. I mean, he's got plenty of the top 3-year-olds in his barn, so I'd be a little surprised if they decide to take on a race like the Travers with him or Raise Kane, but definitely at this grade 3 level, they fit well. Let's move on to the Oaks, which you already teed up a little bit, Craig. That is the Grade 3 Indiana Oaks. And kind of a similar situation here where it felt like trips made the difference in the end. Defining Purpose just got to stalk what felt like a pretty slow pace. And Taxed, who was bet down to 4-5 favoritism off her Black Eyed Susan victory, just kind of unlucky at the start, breaking a step slowly, bumping into a foe. She was relegated to last early and hard to close from last place on the dirt into a slow pace.
Yeah, for sure. And we talked about, you mentioned the pace in the Indiana Derby. That one was more on the moderate side. I don't think any of the fractions will be blue, but it did have that increasing pace line where the figures got faster as the race got longer, went longer. In the Indiana Oaks, it's going to be blue fractions, I would imagine. It doesn't look like my assistant gave it a pace upgrade. It's only a 101 TimeformUS speed figure. Again, I'm going to give that a look because these figures just seem unusually low to me for both of the races, giving the top two finishers in each race. But Like I said, there were plenty of other routes on the card. We're not going to talk about them, but there were some older horses that ran pretty fast races. So it does make these races look to be a bit on the slow side. And at the end of the day, they were just grade three for restricted 3-year olds. So maybe the figures make sense. And as you say, I would argue that Taxed really had no chance given this setup.
Yeah, I think that's the explanation for Tax speed figure regressing so much in this spot was the trip and defining purpose. I mean, at the end of the day, she's a horse that just has never really run that fast. I mean, her Ashland was okay, but clearly she wasn't any match for the best 3-year-old fillies in the Kentucky Oaks. And this is a 3-year-old filly crop that we had been talking about it all through the spring and just wasn't really stepping up to run fast races. We saw some exceptions to that in the Oaks to an extent and the Acorn, and I think a little bit in the Black Eyed Susan. But generally, most of the 3-year-old filly stakes in this division have just been a little disappointing from the speed figure standpoint. And then we'll finish up the action at Horseshoe Indianapolis with a stakes from Friday. That was the William Garrett sprinting on the turf, and this one was won, this time at a much shorter price than last time, by No Balls, who got to the front end and is able to achieve his second stakes victory in a row.
Yes, and he kind of backed up that form, even though he was a huge price at Churchill. He was able to get the job done here at Indiana, obviously at a much shorter price. But it wasn't like it was easy. He was challenged on the front end and through fast fractions by a horse called Shimmer Me Timbers. Dueled with that one for a pretty long way, put him away, and really never got challenged after that. Now, he did come in with a pretty big speed figure edge. All the horses in behind him ran their usual speed figures, but it's not like he just had a cakewalk on the front end, is the point I want to make. He had to work for it and was still able to finish off the race.
I agree, and I liked the way he was finishing. It was not a huge margin of victory, but when you watch the replay, the result just never really looked in doubt. He flicked away that token pressure that you were describing, and this feels like this horse has arrived at this point. I know he caused that big upset on Derby week, but he backed it up here, and we'll see if he can compete against some of the top-level sprinters in some bigger races later in the season and eventually make it to the Breeders' Cup Turf Sprint, but certainly nice to see him pair up those stakes wins in this spot. Let's move on to Iowa, and we'll discuss some races from the Prairie Meadows card on Saturday, which included the Iowa Derby. This one is an ungraded stakes race these days, and something we don't see every day, to say the least, Craig. A dead heat that ultimately gets decided via disqualification with a solitary winner, and that was the case in the Iowa Derby, as how did he do that? And One in Vermilion hit the wire simultaneously, but the stewards had something to say about that, as One in Vermilion was ultimately placed second behind the massive long shot. How did he do that? Who, I've got to ask in retrospect, how did he win that?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I will say before we get into the actual horses, I thought the DQ was a no-brainer. Watching the replay, the very first time I saw it, I think the third place finisher actually claimed foul against the top two, not really knowing who caused the interference. But to my mind, it was definitely the horse that got disqualified. The horse that was elevated to the win. How did he do that? Really didn't do anything to cause a problem there. So I think the stewards made a very good call and exactly what they should have done. As to how did he do that, I really don't know. He was kind of the other Steve Asmussen in here, not that the other one was taking a lot of money. I've seen this one other time when I was at Lone Star. I remember a Texas Derby a couple years ago, or maybe it's called the Lone Star Derby. I don't remember now, but he had two long shots and they both ran 1-2 in one of the lesser races. They both took big jumps up in speed figures, and that's what how did he do that did here. He had previously, his best had been a 104. He hadn't really been competitive in the Sunland Derby or the Texas Derby. That's what it is called, as I looked this year. And then the race just kind of came out of nowhere. I can't explain it.
Yeah, it's a hard one to explain, and who would have thought that the 4th and 5th place finishers from the Sunland Derby would dominate the Iowa Derby at odds of 7-1 and 48-1, but that's what happened here. Apparently the Sunland Derby, a future key race for the Iowa Derby. But yeah, One in Vermilion, I agree with you, Craig. It was the right call by the stewards to put him second. I think they actually handled this perfectly. I mean, to not place him behind the third place finisher, but to move him below. How did he do that? I think that's exactly what happened on the racetrack. He was game, though. I mean, this horse looked like he was finished at the top of the stretch and kept battling on all the way to the wire. So game that he tried to bump a rival over to win the race. How did he do that? I mean, he was kind of lightly handled by his jockey through the stretch, but still was able to share the victory and ultimately get the win. A hard one to explain, even looking back at it from a handicapping perspective, but I guess what you have to say is we did have some major no-shows in this race, as Bo Cruz and Iron Clover, who took most of the money, they finished 8th and 10th here, just never really were in the mix once the field turned into the stretch, so that's what you need to have happen for upsets like this to occur. The favorites have to not show up.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, it was a pretty weak field. When you look at the horses that were favored, I mean, Iron Clover came in. He had run a 110 speed figure in his last race, so not exactly a grade one type field by any stretch. And Bo Cruz, who went all favored, he had run a pretty fast race in the Matt win, but that was over a sloppy track. His best fast track race had been just a 111. So it's not like how did he do that? Had to improve 10 lengths to get to the winner's circle. He just needed a little improvement and some others not to show up. And I don't think I mentioned it. He actually ran a 114 TimeformUS speed figure.
And I believe, Craig, I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong, or maybe the listeners can. I believe Iowa is one of those states that is not currently governed by HISA. So some of the form that we see at Prairie Meadows doesn't always translate elsewhere. You'll notice that these horses are all listed as racing on Butte in the chart, which is something that feels like an anachronism in the days of HISA, especially after they've taken over with their medication rules in the middle of May. But I believe, kind of like Texas, Iowa is one of those states that is still in litigation with HISA. So sometimes you see some performances at Prairie Meadows that might not make a whole lot of sense. And we'll move on to the grade 3 Cornhusker, which, obviously there were some horses that could have run in the Suburban that instead went in this direction, and it made the Cornhusker a much stronger race overall, a deeper race, at least, to say that. Horses like Ain't Life Grand, who has been a mainstay at Prairie Meadows and really achieved success there that he's been unable to achieve anywhere else. It's really dichotomous, his form compared to where he's competed at other venues. And, Skippy Longstocking, Call Me Fast, they were coming out of some nice races, but it was the Dale Romans trainee, Giant Game, who kind of recaptured the form that we had seen from him as a 2-year-old. You might remember he was the 3rd place finisher in the 2021 Breeders' Cup Juvenile. Had kind of been a disappointment after that, descended back into allowance company, but he's back on the way up now as a 4-year-old as he was able to wire this field on the front end.
It's funny you said you might remember, because for the life of me, I knew the name, but I had to actually go back and go through his lifetime PPs to see where I remembered it from. And he ran a lifetime best in here, all the way up to a 125 speed figure from TimeformUS. As you said, I don't know how much stock you want to put into that if this horse ships somewhere else, given the different rules they're racing under, but it was certainly a big effort, and he's been a horse who's been improving since he came off that long layoff of almost a year. He showed up at Gulfstream Park early, and every single race he's improved his number, and this is the first time he's taken a big jump all the way up to a number like this. So big effort from him. I wouldn't have been able to predict it, but when you're able to beat a horse like Skippy Longstocking, you had to run pretty good. And it was also a race that he won wire to wire, and it had all red fractions and included a couple 150 pace figures early.
Yeah, this horse really showed up and was game to hold on for the victory, because there were some good horses charging at him at the end. One of the things that I think people sometimes forget about this horse, Craig, is he is from that last crop of Giants Causeway where only 3 foals were produced, sired by Giants Causeway among this current crop of 4-year-olds, which was his final one. And Giant Game was one of them. Classic Causeway was another one of those 3. And obviously Classic Causeway, a grade 1 winner, winning the Belmont Derby last year. Now Giant Game also becoming a graded stakes winner. Just something that's pretty cool from such a small sample for a great sire to have 2 really good ones in his final crop. Let's move on to one more race to discuss from Prairie Meadows. This one actually occurred on their Friday card. The Iowa Sprint saw a pretty big upset as Strobe, who took all the money, forged to the lead at the top of the stretch, but could not hold off the late charge of 24-1 upsetter Ultimate. And kind of in line with what we were talking about, Craig, I don't know where this performance came from. Ultimate, a horse who, based on his prior form at venues other than Prairie Meadows, looks almost impossible to make in this race, struggling to even be competitive in N1X allowance races, but took a huge step forward to win this stakes race.
Good, and it's not like even his first race at Prairie Meadows was that good. He was beaten in a smaller race, which is kind of like a prep for this race, the Ed Kenner Stakes, beaten by a horse Tape to Tape who didn't even run in here. So I don't know where this effort came from. I was really curious when I watched this race if it was a case where Strobe just didn't show up and run his race at all, or allowed Ultimate to win, or one where he jumped up. But looking at the rest of the card, it sure looks like he jumped up because all the horses in behind, other than the last two finishers, ran very similar speed figures to what they've been running. So that he gets a 120 for the day. Strobe gets a 118. He's a horse who he's got a big reputation, Strobe, but he hasn't really produced on the racetrack. He does seem more like a listed grade 3 type horse to me.
Yeah, I was going to say the exact same thing about him. He's a horse who won his first few starts impressively, generated some buzz, but since stepping up into stakes company, he's been a bit of a disappointment, and that certainly continued here, losing a race that he was really supposed to win. Let's move on to California to discuss the third of these three derbies on the dirt that we'll discuss across the country. That was the Los Alamitos Derby run at Los Al on Saturday. This one going the 1.125 distance, and a couple of runners from the Triple Crown Trail returning to action in this race. Reincarnate, who of course was exiting the Kentucky Derby. He had finished 13th in that race, now switched back into the Bob Baffert barn. He was the winner here, leading all the way. Skinner, who of course missed the Kentucky Derby, having last run in the Santa Anita Derby, and then missing a planned start, I believe, in the Affirmed last month, just not training well, according to John Sheriffs. He finally gets back to action in this Los Al Derby, only manages to close for second, though. The winner did have everything his own way on the front end.
Did Reincarnate, he set the pace. It wasn't an overly slow pace. It's just kind of an even line on the pace figures, but it's never going to be a good setup for a horse like Skinner. The race came back pretty slow, and unlike Indiana, it was a fast track. There were plenty of other routes on the card, at least two more that I see, and it just seems like a race where he didn't really, it just wasn't a very fast race. So a little bit disappointing, but I will give the one caution that I'm kind of the mindset that what happens at Los Al stays at Los Al. Some horses seem to really like that course. Others don't. Sometimes the form comes out of it good, but most often it's puzzling. So I'm not going to put a whole lot of faith in the number or judge the horses that ran in this race using that to knock them down. I would expect them to run back to numbers we've seen from them in the past.
Yeah, John Sheriffs mentioned this being a possible springboard to the Travers for Skinner. I would imagine Bob Baffert is considering the same thing for Reincarnate, although it seems like Bob Baffert has multiple Travers candidates at this point that might be even higher in the pecking order than Reincarnate. So we'll see how that plays out for his stable in races like the Haskell and the Jim Dandy in coming weeks. But as you said, speed figure didn't come back that fast for this one, so these horses would really have to step it up to be competitive in the Travers. I doubt John Sheriffs is listening, but personally, if I owned Skinner, I'd be much more interested in the King's Bishop. I'm sorry, the H. Allen Jerkins. Wow. it's been the H. Allen Jerkins for a few years now. Because Skinner just has always struck me as a horse that isn't necessarily better going longer. He physically looks that way to me, and you just get more pace for a deep closer in those one-turn races. So I'd be looking at the Allen Jerkins if I had Skinner, but it sounds like they're much more likely to go to the Travers if they come east at all.
Based off that effort, I'd be more looking at a race like the Oklahoma Derby, but that's just me. I'm just not sure he's as good as that Santa Anita Derby makes him look. That's a race that's been pretty disappointing going forward.
Yeah, I think that's a perfectly fair statement as well, Craig. These horses might just not be at that level. Before we wrap up Los Alamitos, we'll talk about one more race there from their Sunday card. Bob Baffert unveiled a good-looking 2-year-old, a big surprise at this time of year. Prince of Monaco, who took all the money, just not facing much competition, won as easily as you could like. I think, Craig, I'll say I don't know how good this horse is, but I think this is just a preview of what's likely to come from the Bob Baffert stable at Del Mar.
Yeah, he started kind of early this year. We've seen a lot more of his runners show up, even at Santa Anita. This one ran obviously a good race, winning by 8 lengths. Kind of impossible to determine what the combination was, what the competition was. I gave a look at the TimeformUS worksheet for this day. It looks like a pretty straightforward day outside of maybe one race, not this one. And I would guess it's going to be in the upper 90s type speed figure, around 97, give or take a point, which is decent for a 2-year-old. But they're going 5 furlongs in early July. We'll see what this horse turns out to be. I don't think it's a great sign that he showed up already, to be honest.
Yeah, it does feel like Baffert generally reserves his very best 2-year-olds for Del Mar, but these Los Alamitos maiden races, as is evidenced from this race, they're there for the taking. So I don't know if this horse is one of the best 2-year-olds he has out there, but he was certainly good enough to beat the competition that he faced on Sunday. Let's move on to Delaware Park, where the only race we'll discuss from the past week was their feature race on Saturday, the Grade 2 Delaware Handicap. This year shortened from 1.25 miles to 1 3/16, but still, a test of stamina for those fillies and mares. And we saw a really fun battle here as Idiomatic and Classy Edition just threw it down to the finish. And while Idiomatic was only a narrow winner of this race, when you take her entire trip into consideration and that disastrous start, she was much the best.
I agree, much more than the head margin between her and Classy Edition. She wound up with a 118 TimeformUS speed figure, which is actually a 5-point regression from her off her last. But I don't think that's surprising given the trip. She had that tough start. She wound up wide around the second turn, obviously costing some lengths, and was still game. I mean, that rush she made to the lead looked a little bit premature, but it proved to be the right move for Florent Giroux because she was able to hold steady through the lane. And Classy Edition showed up and ran one of her better races, just ran into a better horse on this day.
Yeah, I thought this was a pretty good race for the Delaware Handicap, which has lost some of its luster in recent years, being downgraded to a Grade 2 event. But I think we saw two really nice fillies compete this year. And based on this race, I think Idiomatic is one that they have to consider moving up in class to try the Grade 1 personal ensign at Saratoga. I mean, that race typically comes up with a pretty light field in terms of size. The last few years have only had 5 or 6 runners competing in the personal ensign, though you typically get a deep well of talent in this race from the few that do run there. But Idiomatic feels like one that might be ready for that step up in class. Classy Edition, I mean, she was really game down to the wire. She is a New York bred, so they always have that option to run against state-bred company, and with her being a heavy favorite. So we'll see where they decide to go with each of them, but pretty nice race. 2 good fillies competing in that Delaware Handicap. Let's move on to discuss a couple of non-stakes events to finish up this podcast. We saw a pretty nice 2-year-old filly maiden race at Ellis Park on Friday as the debut runner Here You Come Again was able to stalk the pace en route to victory, going the 5.5 furlong distance. And pretty impressive run from this daughter of Liam's Map, Craig. I like the professionalism that she showed through the lane to pull away from a Brian Lynch runner that had taken a lot of money.
Yeah, and that one ran fine. Wound up with a 96 speed figure Hot Beach, but Here You Come Again was just a better horse. I got a little bit of a jump on that one and was pulling away through the lane, just kind of held sway the last furlong, but wound up with a really nice 102 speed figure. When you see that from a 2-year-old, particularly a filly this early in the season, that is a pretty quick race for her. It's too early to guess where these horses are going to show up, but she certainly looks like one that has stakes potential.
Yeah, we've seen some pretty decent 2-year-old racing at Ellis Park this meet. I mean, obviously, a lot of these horses would have been competing at Churchill Downs, so I think that's elevated the quality of some of these Ellis races as we lead into the summertime. But I think we saw a couple of potentially stakes-bound horses here. Obviously, Here You Come Again could move right into a stakes at Saratoga in her next start. We'll see. Hot Beach still has to break her maiden, but a pretty good maiden race for the 2-year-old fillies at this time of year. Then we'll close things out with one more race to talk about from Laurel Park. On Saturday, they ran a turf allowance race. And normally, Craig, this wouldn't be one that I would throw on the podcast. You know, an older horse allowance race that only gets a 117 TimeformUS speed figure, which is solid, but not quite stakes quality. Except for the fact that this race was won by a 3-year-old, Circling the Drain, who was coming out of a third-place finish behind Nandarok in that race at Pimlico. And this feels like a pretty good budding turf horse for trainer Brittany Russell.
Yeah, yet another good 3-year-old ran a 117 TimeformUS speed figure, just his second try on the turf. And I thought I remembered that race from Pimlico as one that he had a bit of a tough trip that day. Finished a good, very fast closing third. I can't remember if we talked about that. It feels like we did, but I thought he ran very, very well here. He won this race as easy as could be. Now, he was 2-5, but I think that was largely because of Brittany Russell, because there were some horses coming in with some pretty good credentials and some pretty big speed figures, and he was able to win easily, just powering by with a furlong to go and drawing away.
Yeah, I remember when I handicapped that James Murphy. I mean, this was a horse that I felt pretty strongly was going to like the turf, and he did, but just wasn't quite good enough to beat those horses over a mile. This race going a little bit longer than that, and you really saw the way he was able to lengthen his stride and finish at the end. Feels like a son of West Coast that isn't going to be deterred by even longer distances in the future. And, you know, West Coast, you wouldn't think of him as a turf sire, but he's actually had some success with turf runners. Circling the Drain certainly feels like a pretty good one that could be bound for stakes company next time out. Well, Craig, that wraps up our look back at this past weekend. And as I said at the top of the podcast, so much to look forward to on the racing calendar in the coming weeks. Saratoga obviously starting just a couple days from now, opening day being Thursday. And I would imagine we're going to handicap that Saturday pick 5 on our forecast a little bit later this week.
Yeah, I was already looking to see if the PPs were out. They were not. I imagine they're drawing today for that. I don't keep up with stuff like that, and unless I happen to be filling in to make the morning line, which I will never ever do for Saratoga. You couldn't pay me enough to do that one, so I wish you well. I know you are going to be swamped the next 6 weeks or so, and we'll try to keep it not too busy, but we're going to have a lot to talk about between Del Mar and Saratoga, and plenty other good racing around the country as well, with Colonial Downs open. That'll probably fly a little under the radar, but they're going to have some really nice races, so very fun time of year for us horse racing fans.
Yeah, the draw for that Saturday card is actually Wednesday. I wish it was Tuesday. It would give me an extra 24 hours to work on it, but that is not the case. They draw those Saturday cards on Wednesday for Saratoga. So we'll check out that. And I would imagine we'll try to record that forecast maybe on Thursday. It probably comes out Friday morning this week, but we'll almost definitely be discussing that Saratoga sequence, as the first couple of cards, I've already handicapped them. They look pretty strong, so definitely a lot to look forward to upcoming at the Spa meet this summer. Everybody, thanks for tuning in to the TimeformUS Pacecast this week. Remember, you can always catch these podcasts on DRF.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Wherever you get your podcast, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Again, thanks for tuning in, and make sure to catch that TimeformUS forecast coming up later in the week.